Welcome to another college-wide Graduate Institute Summer Lecture Series event. My name is Ned Walpin. I am the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs in Santa Fe. It is wonderful again to see so many students, staff, faculty, and alumni from both campuses, as well as some of our prospective students and our other friends of the college here this evening. I would first like to let you know that there will be a lecture on teaching poetry, revelation, mathematics, and respect for truth by Ted Hadzi-Antish tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Information on how to join that lecture has been sent out in separate emails and is also posted on the St. John's College website. Next Tuesday, tutor Janet Doherty will lecture on the recovery of the good and the noble. Can Xenophon's Socrates help? To be followed next Wednesday with a lecture on happiness in Book 1 of Herodotus's Histories by Carrie Baldwin. Information for those events will be sent out by email as well as will be posted on our website. I am happy to introduce two of my colleagues who will join in conversation this evening on the idea of the common good. They are David McDonald and Seth Appelbaum. Mr. McDonald, my predecessor as the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs, has been a tutor here for 15 years. Mr. Applebaum joined the faculty in 2017, but feels to me like he's been here forever. This event will be organized as follows. Mr. McDonald and Mr. Applebaum will start this evening holding a conversation with each other on the subject of the common good, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience to be submitted in the Zoom Q&A function. I will read the questions aloud to our panelists and for the audience to hear. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Walpin. I think I'll start things off, Mr. Applebaum, in this way. I was observing our public health situation, and one hears these reports and even comes across people who have this attitude that that they ought not to be compelled to wear a mask in a time of contagion. And it struck me when I was inwardly critiquing that position that I had an implicit notion of the common good in mind, and then I started to suspect that the common good as an idea was fading, maybe needs to be reinvoked, maybe is being reinvoked, but that I didn't have a really clear sense of what it was I was thinking about when I thought about the common good. So that was what occasioned this, at least in my mind. So I have some preliminary notions I could put out there.
Be my guest.
Okay, so I'll start with Aristotle, who clearly sees a community like a city, a polis, as being founded for the sake of a common good. And that tradition carries on through Aquinas. But then there's another tradition that's more immediate to the American situation, which comes from Locke, and seems to head in the direction of a more private sense of what a society is for. And so one of the questions I have is to what extent the Lockean approach is to what extent it can hold up against some of the other forces that are active when it comes to preserving enough of a sense of being in this together that we can rely on one another to be solicitous for our health.
So how do we want to differentiate that Lockean conception? Because I might think about it something like this. In the more modern notion, the common good is maybe an overlap or sort of simultaneous co-location of the individual goods of all the different citizens, all different individuals. And I feel like that the public health case kind of fits that paradigm, doesn't it? Because I don't know if the health of the society as such is what I'm thinking about when I want everyone to wear a mask, so much as I'm thinking of my health. Don't you get me sick? And you also don't want to get sick, so we all don't get sick together.
Yeah. So it's an aggregation of private goods.
Yeah, aggregation.
Yeah. And the way Locke seems to, so the way Locke frames it is in terms of property, where property has a much larger sense than it does for most of us. That for him, property would include life, liberty, and estate. So your physiological being, your freedom to I suppose think things, say things, do things, and whatever stuff you've acquired, including land and things like that. So his claim is that a government is or ought to be set up for the sake of preservation of property, where property includes all of these things. And I think, I mean, the way I read him in his second treatise on government, what this really amounts to is saying that a government or a commonwealth exists for the sake of making a private sphere possible. Now, I think that gives us a somewhat tenuous basis for demanding that someone else wear a mask for the sake of our health. Or that's my fear, is that for someone who's committed to these Lockean principles in the more radical form that they appear these days, it can be hard to prevail upon them to look out for my health.
Right, and I guess you do wind up with this problem from time to time where, you know, and I know that I'm stepping out of my lane and I'm getting out of my wheelhouse and I'm talking about things I don't really understand, but, you know, you hear these phrases like, well, such and such a thing, that's a public nuisance, someone ought to do something about it, or, you know, that company is putting, you know, sewage into our water reservoir, that's a public nuisance, or a negative externality or something like that. And then you have to say, well, if we're going to do something about it, we have to do something about it in such a way that nevertheless respects the private sphere, respects the fact that they're entitled to do whatever they want on their property. And then the difficulties come when, you know, there's leakage or overflow or whatever you want to call it from the private into the, not necessarily into the commons or into the public, but into the other cells of the private.
Yeah. So that could be the public health argument in a Lockean context. You would say, don't contaminate my cell.
Don't sneeze on me.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
So there's a certain American position which Ross Douthat calls folk libertarianism, and that's the sort of position where one says, I don't like being told what to do, and I don't care whether you're worried about getting ill on account of me. If I don't want to wear a mask, I'm not going to wear a mask. And I'm wondering what the relation of that position is to the sort of original Lockean conception. It does not seem to me that Locke is saying everyone can be or ought to be out for themselves. And even in the way you've discussed it, where you know, you're not to impinge on my cell and I'm not to impinge on your cell, there's still an acknowledgement that other people have a private life which ought to be protected. in this folk libertarianism, it appears that there's no necessary regard for the dignity of other people's lives. Am I being too stark about it? And I'm wondering, how did we get there? Like, how would one justify the folk libertarianism, or what's the support, if any, for that kind of position?
I guess you could say that, and again, this is maybe broader than Locke in some way to me, that alongside sort of civilization, there has always been a periphery or a frontier occupied by the barbarians, who are in some sense more free than the city folk. And there's less of them, they're more widely spread out, and they can they have a kind of right to do whatever they want because there's no one else really to affect. And I guess I see the folk libertarianism as being, the distinctively American sort of frontier heritage in a way that, I'm going to light out for the territories.
Yeah.
And, I'm not going to mess with anyone out there because I'm not going to run into people very often. And I'm going there, in fact, to be left alone.
Yeah. Yeah. So that presupposes an inexhaustible area of land, or the ability to neither, the ability to not run across other people, not to be dependent on other people. These days, you might hear that attitude not just from someone living rurally, but from someone living in a suburban or urban environment, but who might have persuaded themselves that they're self-sufficient because they're not dependent on any particular community. They may, for their financial and material situation may all be mediated by technology and various kinds of services that allow them to persuade themselves that they don't have any reliance on others. So it's a kind of frontier mentality transplanted into the suburbs. But it's so conditioned by technology that maybe one loses sight of the extent to which it's very much a libertarianism of this moment.
Yes, that's astute. I think that in some sense the American ethos has been kind of I guess you could say civilization has kind of leapfrogged over our kind of rural or even sort of frontier freedom, such that the people who have kind of imbibed this ethos are now, penned into the urban or suburban environment, and they have instincts and impulses that are, are a little bit wayward, I think, or would be perceived as being wayward in that new context. And yet it's something, though, that has to be given its due, I think. I don't know if it has to be given its due because it's a particularly rational response so much as it's something that is just so much part of our mores and it's so baked in that you have to, include it in your kind of prudential calculations and your kind of technocratic analysis. You have to factor this in, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm not making a normative statement exactly. I'm just sort of saying, this seems to me this is how it is in this country.
Right. Yeah. So that folk libertarianism, I think it does seem to presume that things are expansive enough that one could sustain a sense of self-sufficiency. And interestingly, I noticed in looking at Locke that he seems to assume an inexhaustible commons. I think the way he puts it is basically you can appropriate anything, make anything your property through labor, where there is, these are his words, where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So the proviso in the Lockean scheme with regard to acquisition is, as long as there's plenty left for other people to do their acquisitive work, then there's no difficulty really. And here's what intrigued me about that is that there is that implication in Locke that what's common to all of us, the things we all rely on, can be understood as inexhaustible, at least practically speaking. But we begin to run into a kind of degradation of the commons or dwindling resources. And that's in contrast to how I'm understanding Aquinas, when he's talking about the common good. So he's picking up with the Aristotelian thinking and amplifying it and extending it. And what I'm understanding him to say about the common good is that it has to be a good that is not exhaustible, and that we can all draw upon without depleting it. So while for Locke there's the Commonwealth exists for the sake of the preservation of property, and it becomes more and more clear over the centuries that the commons from which property is drawn is not infinite. For Aquinas, the common good, the thing that the common good is aimed toward is by its nature inexhaustible, and has a moral dimension. It's really what a commonwealth or society is for happiness, and that's a shared good that we can't deplete by partaking of it. Whereas property has this different quality. I think I mean, this is kind of where I have some doubts about the Lockean scheme. Is it looks to me like it's premised on there being limitlessness in resources, and it's premised really on a material good. The older approach that comes from Aristotle and Aquinas, the good is more in the ethical or moral realm, and therefore, we could all be engaging in that good without stepping on each other.
Okay, so maybe there's a couple things we want to disentangle then. So there's the sense in which the common good is something, a kind of institutional structure that allows us to appropriate from the commons for ourselves. And I guess in Locke that ranges from, improving land through agriculture to just the sense that even if I pick an apple off a tree, I'm appropriating it in that space between pulling it off and taking a bite. You can't. That's when property sort of begins, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that sense in which my sort of appropriation or possession needs some kind of support once it's taken place. But the thing from which I'm appropriating, or the kind of raw stuff that I'm turning into my property by my labor, I don't really detect Locke taking a special care about that or a special interest in it. I mean, he says some things like, I shouldn't take a bunch of plums, right? Because more plums than I can eat because they'll rot or something like that. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's some sense that there could be scarcity out there. Now that I think about it, okay, so because doesn't he say something like the improved land is, let's say 9 out of 10 of the value of land comes from labor. No, 99 out of 100 or something like that. I guess if you think that productivity kind of keeps increasing, I could say that as technology improves, the commons in a sense gets bigger because I need less of it to take something from.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It does, and I think I remember, for example, the passage where he says something like, when you improve a piece of land, you're adding to the common stock of mankind. You're amplifying the productivity of that land, and therefore it's as if you expanded the commons essentially. Yeah.
I mean, but technology would have to keep increasing as all other things being equal, you
Yeah.
know, productivity would have to keep increasing, which I suppose means technical enhancement would have to continue. I mean, that's something that's got to be in the background for him.
Yeah. And I suppose he's not taking account of the possibility of there being a kind of collective fouling of our nest, such that notwithstanding technological progress and increased productivity, the fundamental things we rely on, like air and water, reliable seasons, those things could become so fouled that there'd be a kind of deeper crisis of the commons.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never really thought of that before. I wonder about this. I mean, there's those super interesting discussions, right, in the beginning of the Politics, where he talks about the different ways of life and the natural ways of life and things like that. And I mean, Aristotle, I mean, you may want to take this with a grain of salt, but he seems to suggest in the beginning of the Politics that, you know, you've got your hunters and your gatherers and your shepherds, your pastoral people, and your your pirates as well. Your pirates and your raiders, the people who farm people, I guess you could call them. And it seems like those are the people who are just taking stuff out of the commons as much as they need at a given time. They perhaps partake in a lifestyle that is mobile, such that they can't really acquire that much. It's only the sedentary, you know, your farmers and your city people who are going to be making permanent kind of multi-seasonal removals from the commons. And then there's because another kind of inexhaustibility comes up there, because once I've started adopting money as a means of exchange, I can start doing all these things where my money grows without me necessarily appropriating anything else from the commons. And you see something similar in Locke, don't you?
Yeah.
That money, in a sense, so somehow I can make more money without necessarily putting my labor into anything. And I'm not really appropriating anything out of the commons when I do that. But there's an inexhaustibility. You can just keep reinvesting the profits, and off you go.
And you get credit for having labored. I mean, at least the way Locke puts it, you know, basically because we all consented to use this thing called money, which required our consent in order to have value. And I think I forget how he puts it exactly, but and in as much as labor is always associated with property and value, it's like the virtue of labor just kind of rubs off on money, and then inequality is legitimate on that basis, because or I don't know, it's hard to tell where he's at with inequality, but he's at least allowing that money is a mechanism whereby some kind of allowable inequality can emerge. The status of that argument is peculiar. It's hard to tell what he's really up to there.
Right, and we may be beginning to sort of probe the limits of my understanding of Locke. I mean, that's something I've always found to be one of the most interesting parts of that book, is what precisely the status of money is. Well, I guess in a way we've kind of wound our way back to thinking about the common good again as a sort of collection of, or aggregate of, overlapping interests. Well, because money is a funny instance of this, because as you've said, I mean, you called our attention to the conventional character of money, and conventions require the support of the whole community in a way. I mean, it's just pieces of paper, or just numbers, if you're not in some way giving your consent to it having a meaning. And I think that's, you know, Aristotle had that awareness as well. And isn't the Greek word for money, it has nomos in it somewhere? Numisma or numismatics or whatever.
Yeah. I think though, so you were saying that we're back to the notion of the common good as some kind of aggregate of individual, of local or household or private goods, or at least you referred to that notion, and that's where I'm wanting to look toward the Aristotelian or Thomistic vision of a good that genuinely is beyond private interest. It's not just a lot of private interest pulled together and then protected through some kind of covenant or agreement, but that there could be an ethical aim that's genuinely, that somehow is more than the sum of its parts. But what I can't tell in the current context is whether invoking that idea amounts to being nostalgic for something that simply has no foothold in our current Lockean way of life, or whether there's a way to make this older sense of common good as standing outside of us, where that could pertain again. In other words, am I simply a nostalgist, or is there? What are we to do with these older notions that are not grounded in the private? I think they're grounded in the public. I think the sense is, at least this is how I take Aristotle, that private life ultimately is for the sake of public life. It's not that the public is for the sake of facilitating lots of little private projects. So that's part of what's at stake, I suppose. But I'm just wondering whether that sense of public good, can it be revived? Does it have any relevance to our current situation where we've already sort of collapsed into all these private spheres?
Right. That was a tough question, isn't it? Because you can go in a few different directions. One thing I might want to say about the common good in that respect is, don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years in that sense.
Yeah.
Just that families all involve something like that, I would say. You can try to analyze the family in those terms of overlapping of private interest, but I don't think that's how people who are actually in families think about it. There's so much self-sacrifice required, and so much involvement beyond just maximization of utility or something like that.
And when you speak that way, you're seeing the household or family as its own little society, its own.
Yes, right. It's its own little. I don't know. I hate to use the cliches, but the little platoons.
Yeah.
Or I think of the picture on the front of that, and if you want to expand up a level, I think of the picture on the front of that edition of Democracy in America that we sent all the GIs, the town meeting, that painting, the town meeting. Mm. And I think things like that still take place. And when I look at that painting, I guess I don't just see people getting together simply to fix a pothole or something because it's too hard for one of them to do it and everyone uses the road. But I see people who are living the political life in a sense, taking part in something greater than themselves. And exercising capacities,
Okay. So you would say, it sounds like you would say that the family is intrinsically oriented toward a good that's not merely about what individuals want. And then by extension, you can imagine local politics.
Yeah.
Quality.
And I know I'm being a little romantic there. But it does, I think it could still, it could and it does still happen. Yeah.
So is there a national politics like this?
Well, this is a question. Do people actually want that? That's something I wonder. One reason I think that liberalism has been so successful is because people sort of wanted to banish the supra-human from the political realm. In a certain sense, people wanted to say, maybe just a co-location of interest is fine by me. That's a simpler thing, and it involves less conflict. It involves less intensity of conflict, and you can try to manage what conflict there is by technocratic means or sort of social science or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. And for those unfamiliar with the term being used in this sense, I think we should say that Locke is generally seen as the progenitor of the liberal tradition in some sense, and I guess we could characterize it as being one where indeed things like religion are privatized, and you might be able to do this better than I can. I'm not sure how. I mean, what's the quick summary of liberalism?
I mean, I thought you just gave a pretty good one. I mean, you start wanting to say things like, well, everyone is sort of living their own private life. And okay, so let me say one thing. Okay, so you could say that in a pre-liberal or pre-modern way of life, like the polis, like the Greek city-state or something. Mm-hmm. Everyone's looking over everybody's shoulder. Everyone's fundamental relationship to each other is fellow citizen, and they make up the community together. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it seems to me with modernity, I'm now in my cell, really. We're all separated. We're all maybe as family units, but maybe really as individual units. And I'm only going to relate to you over there, Mr. McDonald, through the state. Mm-hmm. I've sort of given up my public relations to others to be managed by the state. So I have a one-to-one relationship with the state, and my relationship to you is going to be mediated through the state. Now, I will still interact with you because we can be in a book club together, or we can be coworkers, or we go to church together. And that's society. That's another little like carved off realm. Uh-huh. But as far as politics, I'm totally mediated. My relationship to you is mediated through the state. You can call it the Leviathan or whatever. Locke puts a nicer smiley face in the Leviathan, but still the Leviathan. Uh-huh. That I don't know how that works, but that's how I think of it. Yeah. We still have something like the polis, but that's now the realm of society as opposed to the realm of politics. Okay. So you're saying that modernity, liberal modernity, involves splitting politics from the social. So you've got government, which is doing these things, but then my civic life might involve, hobbies and barbecues and getting together with friends and maybe being part of a club. We could say something more elevated than that. We could be, I mean, I would think it includes the entire realm of commerce, which is not really elevated, but religion and St. John's, for instance, is part of the social sphere, I guess. And, but also the things you're talking about as well, bowling, if you're not bowling alone, as that book title called it. Right. And the way we got into this strand of the conversation was you were saying that part of what's distinctive about the liberal tradition, and by extension about modernity, is that we deliberately exile the immaterial. It's no longer a public concern, right? So any kind of ethical scheme that might be grounded in religious or philosophical principles is, or grounded in some claim about the unseen. That's off limits now, and partly I take it because there was a kind of exhaustion with people hacking each other to pieces about religious questions. Is part of how we get there. Yes, it's true, and I guess what I feel like what you're putting your finger on is really, in some sense, one of the biggest questions about liberalism and modernity. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is like the last thing I'll say, and then you'll say something after that. But I feel like I want to stop myself here. Mm-hmm. It seems like one of the big questions that we have about living in a liberal society where the common good is understood really in a sense of utility, and if there's any other kind of common good that's exiled to the what we're calling the social or the private realm.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, because of things like the COVID or wars or environmental catastrophes or whatever you have it, we are called upon to make like collective sacrifices or to be part of collective projects. And that seems to implicate something higher than oneself that you have to believe in. Because it's so easy and there's so much advantage to being a free rider that to take part in things bigger than yourself, I think you need something extra. And I mean, isn't this the question? Can liberalism have touch an emotional chord, touch a spiritual chord, provide a goal for people? I mean, you could think of something like the American space program or something where people felt they were involved in a collective project. I mean, it's a bit darker, but you could say, I don't know, the Cold War or something, a sense of a collective struggle against communism that was not just about fighting for your own, hometown or something, but a certain attachment to ways of life and defending an ethos or something like that. And I guess you could say that maybe are those things that can be generated from within liberalism, those kind of attachments, or is liberalism parasitic or reliant on older pre-modern forms of I'm not sure what to call it.
Moral sources.
Religion isn't quite right. Moral sources that it itself can't generate and in fact corrodes by design. I'll stop myself there, but I feel like you put your finger on what to me is like the major question of our era, really.
And and here's what struck me in looking at the Locke was that he still assumes the presence of a religious moral source. Like in the early part of the second treatise, he's talking about liberty and equality as both being natural to us, and I think in both cases it's essentially a religious argument, but he ends up he invokes he has a long quotation from is it Hooker? Yeah, it's I think it's
the judicious Hooker.
The judicious Hooker. That basically grounds equality in Scripture, and I ought to be looking out for my neighbor in what sounded to me very much like a kind of religious model of neighborly love, because we all have the same divine parentage, and just as we all might endeavor to gain property, we're all the property of God, and that puts us on the same footing. And you can see that as being in keeping with Locke's sort of radical Protestantism. So that's the basis for the Lockean equality, and hence for liberal equality. But as you suggest, it does seem to me that there's something about everything being privatized that will tend to erode a shared civic sense of transcendent value, whether that comes from religion or from Locke's sense of religion or some other one. So that then one of the necessary supports of the claims of equality gets it wears away, and then it becomes harder and harder for, as you say, for us to muster the enthusiasm for some shared project that might rely on a sense of there being some goal or aim outside of our own wishes. But further, it erodes this claim about equality, which in the American instance seems crucial to us succeeding on our own terms as a national project. Is that we preserve this sense of regard for for others.
What's
And wear
that
masks.
expression? We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men created equal, endowed by their creator, certain inalienable rights. I mean, is that a sentence that can be generated and believed from within the liberal horizon simply? Or does it draw on older, more primitive sources that where we're kind of sawing off the limb we're standing on in some ways?
Mm-hmm. So if that's so, then we'd be in this odd position where this particular kind of political project was undertaken, at least in part, for the sake of individual freedom of conscience and religious liberty. I mean, that's at least how it comes to be understood in the, at least in some threads in the American founding. And yet, one might end up simply with such a splintering of religious opinion, so many different private religions, that whatever kind of transcendent claims needed to have been there, they're just not accessible, not as a common thing. Yeah, it sounds like a predicament.
Yeah, I mean, that's the common, I mean, in some sense, that's the common good that we are, I guess that's one of the things that initiated this conversation for us, and was sort of the sense that what the commons involved is not just overlapping private enterprises, but it is a kind of common good for a community to share a moral intellectual horizon. Mm-hmm. Can be the basis for that sharing, which is something that's good in itself, but also of immense instrumental value.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's how it seems that Aristotle sees the good life. Is that it's intrinsically good. It's something everyone ought to be practicing, but it also will be conducive to all the things that these days we would call thriving or happiness. So we could take a look at the list of questions here and see what we ought to pick up there.
Sure.
Do you want to help us out, Mr. Walpen?
Sure. So what's interesting, of course, is that there's a significant split, and I think this seems just right given where you have placed your conversation. There's a split between questions having to do with, let's say, earlier philosophy, and then more sort of contemporary questions. And why don't I guess for the sake of shaping the conversation and the questions some, why don't we start with one of the questions asking about earlier thinkers, and then we can move to more contemporary questions. So okay. One questioner asks, I haven't read Locke yet, but I'm thinking about Book 8 of the Republic, where Socrates acknowledges the attractiveness of democracy is the freedom it has, but that this obsession with freedom weakens it and makes it exploitable for the tyrant who pulls for the good of one faction, breaking the common good. Is this what's going on? I asked, having the sense that it is, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, knowing more of the defenses or maybe the safeguards for democracy that comes later in the program.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so Book 8 of the Republic, when we're speaking about democracy, I suppose each of the regimes is in a way characterized by a question of who and a question of what. Who are the ones who are going to be sharers in the common good, and what is the good that they are going to be sharing in? And in the case of democracy, I suppose it's everybody or the multitude, and what they're sharing in is freedom. That is, everyone who is a free person has a share in the regime. So then in the analysis, I think we see in the Republic, and again, it's been a while since I've read these particular sections, but Isn't it the case that the principle of each regime actually undermines and it's the undoing of that regime? So then it's the excess of freedom that somehow undermines the democracy.
And I thought maybe the questioner here was suspecting that there was something especially fragile about the common good in the context of democracy. The way the questioner puts it is, this obsession with freedom weakens it and makes it exploitable for the tyrant who pulls for the good of one faction. So I guess the sense is, and I forget how these different regimes degenerate and transmute into one another, but here the questioner seems to think that democracy has a particular liability toward factionalism, at least. That's actually kind of where the Federalist Papers went, the ones that we read for one of these weeks we did with high schoolers recently, reading the Federalist Papers, and faction is a big concern there as a liability of democratic government, and it's part of why we go in the direction of republic rather than direct democracy.
Here's another question. Is man a citizen by nature or by nomos alone?
And maybe we should bring out the meaning of nomos for those who haven't run across that term. I take it nomos means something like law, custom, some blending of what we take to be law or custom in the modern sense, somewhere in that realm.
One might say it's often used as opposed to nature. Physis and nomos, the Greek word for nature, physis. We get our word physics from there.
Yeah.
And Greek word, and the word for law or convention, nomos. And those things are, as in this questioner's formulation, those things are sort of often posed as opposite poles in philosophy, nature and convention. So, well, just repeat the question again.
Well, let's see here.
I have it here.
Is man a citizen by nature or by nomos alone? And there actually is a second half of this question, I see. And if by nature, is there a regime that is by nature?
So I'll take a try at the first part of the question and say, I think that by Aristotle's account, man is essentially a citizen by nature because man is social and political by nature, and the state is natural. It's not an artifice the way that one might regard it in the modern frame. So that's a start. That's how it looks to me. Is that at least for Aristotle, citizenship is natural to us, you could say.
Okay, let's sit on that for a second. So okay, you could have one way of thinking about human beings where there are social by nature, and then not only social, but also political, which is like a certain kind of sociality.
Yeah, and I elided the two, so you're right to...
You elided them. I think for our purposes, we don't necessarily need to separate those yet. Okay, and then you have the modern view, which is what I was sort of speaking about at the end of our discussion, where you've got, I don't relate to you directly. I relate through Leviathan, and part of the reason for that is I'm an unsocial being. I'm just not very nice, and it has to be made worth my while, perhaps with a bit of coercion, to make me social at all. And there's like a nice version of that with Rousseau, and a nasty version of that with Hobbes and Locke, maybe. But then you have the ancients who sort of don't think that. They think people are, at the least, naturally gregarious or social or something. But then I want to actually, though, go into that thing that we were eliding, what the distinction is between saying people are political versus saying that they're social, and whether man is naturally a citizen. I think Aristotle thinks the only citizens are to be found in the polis, in the Greek city-state. And the polis, it really only existed for a very short time in the immense expanse of human history. So it's kind of a peculiar thought that human nature in this way, if it's true that we're naturally political, human nature was only sort of fulfilled for a very short time in one very small place. That could be true. I mean, that could be true, but it's kind of a remarkable statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a question, this is moving us towards more contemporary stuff. The question goes, this conversation began by discussing the refusal to wear a mask. I couldn't help but think about Dostoevsky's note from Underground and a moment from the brothers Karamazov. Though I agree a sense of defiance against authority in favor of self-reliance is distinctly American, as mentioned in reference to folk libertarianism. I think that was you, Mr. McDonald. Dostoevsky's Underground Man rebels against a sort of common good or societal values to show he has free will and cannot be played like a piano. Even if a utopian society were achieved on Earth, the Underground Man says he would rebel just to show he could. Though I do not think that those who refuse to wear a mask have undergone the extensive thought or life underground as Dostoevsky's protagonist, I am wondering if there are parallels to be drawn between Dostoevsky's statement about human nature and the refusal of many to wear a mask, despite the high likelihood of infecting others. Are humans defiant by nature? Is the current dilemma a sort of illustration of humans' defiant nature as put forth by Dostoevsky?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure where to go with this, but one thing I would say is it does seem to me that there's a peculiar affliction, and it may be a modern affliction more than an affliction of pre-modernity, where we are haunted by a sense of unreality with regard to ourselves, and this is despite all the ways in which modern societies vindicate selfhood, and it starts to feel like one has to make a kind of an act of pure assertion in order to be real. And I'm sure that someone who's a more astute reader of modern philosophy than I am would be able to fill that out a bit. But there's a certain kind of nastiness that I think emerges from trying to be vividly present. I don't know whether one can connect that to a Nietzschean take or.
I could connect it to thumos, spiritedness, which I think has always been with us, and it may be with all living beings to some degree. And I can see that the refusal to wear a mask has a thumos element. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to particularly engage with the merits of wearing the mask or not wearing the mask. I'm simply thinking of psychology. Mm-hmm. So I guess I can see a thumotic side to that, in a certain sense that it's beneath human dignity, or at least my dignity, to put this thing on my face and wear it. And because I can't express myself with it on, it's uncomfortable, and you're just telling me to do it. It reminds me, not to compare small things with great, but it does remind me of that anecdote from Fukuyama's End of History that maybe he got from Václav Havel about the butcher in Prague who has to put that sign in his window. And Fukuyama says, well, this is why these regimes are falling down all over the place, because this butcher is being made to put the sign, workers of the world unite or something in his window. And he doesn't believe it, but he's tired of being told he has to put this thing up there. And again, not to control small things with great, not to compare small things with great, but I can see that there's a certain sense that some people have that being made to wear the mask is like that butcher being told to put the poster in the window, and it activates people's thumos. And
mm-hmm.
I don't love it because I don't want to get sick and I don't want other people to get sick, but I also would not be happy if human beings couldn't muster a response to their surroundings that includes this kind of thumos. I think we need it.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe misdirected, but I'm glad that it's still there. It's part of the well of human capacities.
So maybe now's the time, in a way, to move towards more contemporary questions in response, because in a certain sense you've pushed us there, Seth. But for a second, that's right. But I sort of want to take it in an even tougher direction, which is to say, yeah, we're living right now 1918, the pandemic, over again, and the issues around the commons that you guys have been talking about are significantly focused on, in as much as we were talking about public stuff, had to do with issues of the commons around notions that issues of masks and things having to do with the commons in the safety of others. But we're not just living 1918 again. We're living 1933 again, and we're living 1968 again. And I wonder whether in particular, having to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, we are actually seeing a kind of long-delayed assertion of the commons in a way that is actually, that maybe in some sense is a counter, what do you want to say, a counter impulse to the kinds of impulses we see against the commons in people refusing to wear masks, that we're living all these impulses at once. What are your thoughts on that?
I would at least say that it looks like a revival of concern for others, and a revival of an assertion of there being an ethical, that there ought to be a shared ethical concern that binds us together. I'm not sure what to make of these different previous eras coinciding, but it does seem to me that part of the political situation right now is indeed it's reflecting a wish to see a reassertion of ethics, a reassertion of a moral project for America.
At least on some people's parts, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, then maybe in that case, to that list of years, you also want to add 1989.
Say more.
Well, just if the fact is that I guess I don't necessarily want to say that this is only the case right now in the year 2020, but it seems to me some of the passions swirling around 4 years ago in 2016 also have something to do with a widespread sense among Americans and among people everywhere, maybe all over the sort of industrialized, globalized world, a kind of materialistic view of human life is somehow not cutting it anymore. And maybe one could look at that cynically and say, well, that's because in a material sense, it's not what it was cracked up to be. But I would think even very many of the people who are out in the streets then and now are probably comfortable by many standards, and they're responding to a need for something more. I guess that's what McDonald was saying.
I see. So the way you're putting it, we've got a pandemic, we've got an economic crisis, we've got a deep racial justice crisis, and you're saying there's a continuation of, let's say, an anti-globalization. Is that sort of what you're thinking in terms of? I'm sort of reducing to a bumper sticker what you were saying, but the at least the complaint against globalization is one in which there's been a kind of destruction of a kind of the possibility of living well in some way. Is that sort of where you were going, Seth?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I mean, I don't want to critique someone who I think is so intelligent and such an adept thinker as Fukuyama, but one thing you could say is that the collapse of the Eastern Bloc it looked like a victory for globalization because all those people are going to be integrated into the Western post-war market economy order. But actually, in some sense, I mean, we see this now more clearly maybe than we did then. It's a national assertion or a local assertion. And a desire for decentralization and a desire for autonomy.
I see. So 1989, not as the globalization, as the sort of first move towards, because you tied it to the 2020 election, or sorry, the 2016 election,
Yeah.
but not in as much as a leading towards a rapidly expanding globalization and a reaction to that, but a kind of movement away from a kind of the movement towards localism.
Yes, and I that's what I'm thinking. And I mean, you could wonder, is 2020 the West's 1989 or something like that? And then, I mean, I do think this feeds back into our overall theme about the common good, because there is a real question about the extent to which a common good can be perceived among larger and larger bodies or more heterogeneous bodies. I mean, is there a sense, I mean, this is why trade agreements, for instance, are difficult, because in some mechanical sense, there is a common good between a country over here and a country over there. But there may be a lot of countervailing forces where there's going to be winners and losers within each of those countries to that trade deal. And some might say the common good applies to us within this circle. We're the commons. The global economy is not the commons, and there can't be a common good in that sense. So I don't know. I see the theme of our discussion as a whole playing in here.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. By the way, one questioner did reasonably ask, what in the world did Mr. Walpin mean by "we are living in 1933 again"? You're right. I was meaning more the stock market crash and the economic crisis, not the rise of Hitler. So, but I think hopefully some people realize that. I want to move to a question that's dealing with contemporary stuff, because I just moved us there. Let's see here. Well, here's one that takes a slightly different route than where I was going. But does America need to mitigate identity politics in order to recover a proper sense of the public good?
Mr. McDonald and I are playing chicken here about who's going to...
So to give a full account of identity politics is its own conversation, but it does seem to me that it becomes harder and harder to know what the principle is that holds society together when identity, the things that distinguish you from others, when those factors become more and more important as the basis for one's way of being in the world, it's harder and harder to see what it is that we have in common. So yeah, I think identity politics presents a challenge to any effort to discern some share, what it would look for us to have a shared thriving. And maybe the outcome that those who are engaged in identity politics look for is simply that my group ought to carve out what it needs and reach some kind of truce with other groups which have contrary wishes, and then we could achieve some kind of stasis. I mean, isn't that I guess that might be as close as one could come to some collective good, when nearly everyone is anchoring their own sense of politics in their identity.
Right. I mean, I think I sort of sign on to a lot of what you were saying there. It strikes me that maybe the question is I mean, I think people who are engaging in what we might want to call identity politics probably don't think of themselves as engaging in identity politics. I think they think they're engaging in politics.
Yeah, right.
In a way, and yet, I think the question winds up something like this: is what is the end state, or what's the goal that's being sought? Is it that people who have been marginalized need to be integrated into a pre-existing understanding of the common good? That is, promises have been made, but they haven't been kept. we are trying to get those promises that have been made to be enforced? Or is this phenomenon of identity politics saying something else, that the context of that initial promise is false or something like that, and the whole thing needs to be rethought root and branch? And I mean, if it's the former, that's one thing, and if it's the latter, that's something where it's hard to see what the future holds. And I know it's in a very abstract level there, but
right. And I guess for what it's worth, my stand is I guess I am not as worried about identity politics being simply destructive. I actually think what Du Bois often talks about the doubleness of the black man in American society is one in which there's simultaneously this sort of colorblind ethos and yet an identification of identity that permeates it, that we are constantly battling on that, and that it's not a simply either or, and that it will never be. It will always be an interplay of both a kind of gathering together and also an articulation of difference. And that actually, from my standpoint, for what it's worth, and I'm supposed to just be the moderator, but seems actually, in many ways, healthy, given how much the identities of so many people have been repressed.
Mm-hmm. That all makes sense to me. I think what I should point out in the way I was referring to identity politics is that I see, for example, Trumpism as also an instance of identity politics, right. Where so that complicates. So that identity politics isn't just something that one might see as a proper reassertion of identities which have been marginalized. It's also a reassertion of a kind of majoritarian. Well, I don't want to get into. I don't want to try to explain what the Trumpist variety of identity politics is, but it. I mean, one could say that there's a kind of intensification of the Lockean situation where more and more people are thinking in terms of what's proper to them, what's personal to them, what's what their own lived difficulties are, and that's going to be how they're going to approach the political sphere. And yeah, there are many ways in which that looks like an understandable and appropriate move, but it remains difficult to see how we find a shared. How do we arrive at a consensus as a society such that we could all feel that we're part of a shared project that is actually for the good of all?
Yeah, that's a real difficulty. And I wonder how much of what we're calling identity politics sort of points to a kind of problematic character of the common good itself that is really very present in the ancient discussions of the common good, and, in the politics. I mean, I like this little factoid that, and someone's going to prove me wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure there's only swears, the by Zeus only comes up a couple times in all of Aristotle. I think they might both be in the politics, and maybe even both in Book 3, the book that discusses the different factions within the regime. And so all these questions, well, okay, common good, but who and what? Who's included in this common good? People say, oh, we have a common good among ourselves, and you're not part of it. You're on the outside somehow. And what is it that we share? I mean, maybe we want to share certain things, but maybe they're not shareable. And then I think about the way in which, for the ancient thinkers, because to some degree of the problematic character of political solutions to the common good, they wind up saying, well, I don't know, philosophy, that's a place where a common good clearly can exist, because you having wisdom and me seeking it, there's something you can share there that is not diminished. And who's to be included? Well, anyone who wants to be, anyone who can take part in that conversation. I mean, this is I'm rambling a bit, but I'll just point out one funny little thing from the end of, I think, book 9 of Nicomachean Ethics, that there's this list of the things friends can do together, and it's, you know, it's sort of what you'd expect: drinking, playing dice, playing checkers, oh, and philosophy. And, you know, those are all sorts of activities where it's clear there's a common good, right? I mean, I can't play checkers by myself. I can't play dice by myself. Even if I'm trying to beat you, what I really want to do is just pass the time together. Yeah. And I think philosophy winds up being one of those things.
So there is a question that maybe moves directly from what you were just saying, Mr. Applebaum. I've been struggling to reconcile my abstract/theoretical belief in a common good, a belief in great human capacity, with my experience in the world. It can feel as though the so many in the U.S. today live lives that prioritize values possibly antithetical to shared higher aims. That is, say, accumulation of individual wealth and materialism, immediacy of gains, rather than valuing slow, contemplative, intellectual gains, some form of exhibition and social media or digital posturing rather than developing deep, honest relationships, perhaps even the appearance of connectedness or community over fewer deep interpersonal relationship. Do you think it is possible to look with clear eyes at American society today and maintain a belief in our shared capacity to elevate our society toward a shared good? Why wouldn't an intellectually honest person recoil from society and endeavor to create his own community of rigor and contemplation, giving up on the hope for the moral intellectual advancement of Americans at large?
Yeah. So part of what the questioner is bringing up is the possibility of retreat, where you would just say, this things are not going well in America. I'm gonna build my own little community, or I'm gonna retreat into solitude. And I was thinking a bit about the effort to build subcommunities in America. You know, there's this long history in America of these communitarian projects. From at least the 1800s all the way through the 1960s and now, and what's odd about them is they don't seem to work out very well. And I don't know what that means, but I think it at least means that trying to establish that small scale community, or even a protracted solitude, a kind of a hermit-like existence, where you turn your back on the larger society because you think it's just not working, or it's corrupt. Those communities and efforts seem to have trouble formulating a durable sense of the good themselves. But I also wanted to point, and maybe it's just that I want to hold out for the possibility and perhaps the necessity of remaining engaged with the national project, even though it looks quite discouraging at times. The other thing I might say is the questioner points out or alludes to the technological side of this, where there's a lot of self-exhibition that goes on, and that seems to be a preoccupation of many. That whatever I do, even if what I'm doing is some kind of political action, it ought to be rendered on social media, and I do think that social media and the technologies which underlie it are a really big factor in the atomization and the kinds of difficulties we're going through right now as a nation. I would just leave it there for now. It just seems to me that's the technological factor is huge, and it's something that distinguishes this age from previous ages.
And you're not giving a prompt for an upcoming conversation you're having later this summer, are you?
I could. I mean, actually, we'll pick that up in 2 weeks. The technology question, and we'll go somewhere with that. But I do think I think the effect of social media is so immense. It's very hard to even reckon its power.
That seems right. And maybe one of its greatest dangers is that it provides a simulacrum of actual experience, actual communal collective experience. I don't know. I've heard it described as a kind of, I don't know, like one of those things you put rats in where they hit a button and
Habit trail.
The pleasure center gets shocked or something. What were you going to say?
I was going to say a habit trail, but you're going more experimental.
I was going more experimentally, maybe. I don't know. It sort of shortened the action reward path so much that people are going insane. I mean, that's my feeling about social media. It's not exactly a force for good in our world.
Yeah. And doesn't it make it embodied endeavors like friendship or some kind of more old-fashioned engagement in politics? It makes those endeavors seem tedious and they require a huge amount of effort. It would be easier to just sit down with my cell phone on the couch and engage in things that feel like action.
I believe that's called slacktivism. Right. I mean, okay. Well, from that perspective, it's interesting to compare social media with, say, television or something like that, which I suppose is a medium that is fading from our world. And I think one of the politically corrosive effects of television, I think George Anastopoulos, who was a professor of law at Loyola, and who had a kind of he's no longer with us, but he had a kind of ongoing relationship with St. John's over the years. He had an excellent article about television that it disintermediated all of our relationships to the government, allowed the president, whoever that was, to sort of speak right into your house. It kind of allowed all those kind of mediating institutions that Tocqueville talks about to be just leapfrogged completely. And it thus eliminated a lot of the sort of things that could slow down people's responses to events and allow a bit more deliberation. And I mean, I'd say social media, it's even worse in a way, because not only is it putting everyone, all the authorities right in your own world there, but it's also projecting you out at all of them. And, it's just been an immense acceleration.
It is interesting that yes, it's a grand equalizer in a way. It takes authority away from institutions, as you were saying, and Tocqueville was talking about also, which authority of institutions that actually can gather us together. But of course, the biggest institution that used to have an authority force, it doesn't seem to in the same way as religion. And so there is a question from a listener about religion. I find it an impossible claim that policy decisions can be made without a philosophical/spiritual position or grounding which determines one's sense of the greater good. I therefore find modern liberal secularism an inherently dishonest worldview, claiming to be the view from nowhere and what everyone has in common, while actually it is a very specific set of claims about reality and the good clearly at odds with other views. It claims to be not religious, but it is a view of the unseen, namely the unseen is unimportant, which is a radical claim. What are your thoughts on this?
Let's see. It's a question where I might want to reread the formula.
It's in the answer. It's in the answered tab. I just moved it over.
Okay.
It's the fourth one down.
Right. I think there's something to that. I think what I find sort of interesting about that question and maybe again, I like to ask the questioner, do you think, well, no, I guess maybe I was reading it wrong. I guess the questioner is saying something like, sort of modern liberal secularism claims to be not an ideology, precisely the one way of thinking that's not an ideology. Everything else is an ideology compared to it, or a religion or something like that. It's the one that is part of the reality-based community or something like that.
Right.
But if you think about human history, it's something that didn't exist until yesterday, or at most the day before yesterday. And it's chock full of metaphysical presuppositions about what human beings are that are greatly at odds with those that have been held by everybody throughout history and are probably the ones that are held at the instinctual level by everybody right now. And I guess the question is, does liberal secularism do itself any favors by presenting itself as a simply demonstrably rational approach to the world that is unquestionable, and just kind of try to exempt itself from the marketplace of ideas, so to speak? Or ought it to sort of get down there in the mud and sort of try to argue for itself? I think the latter, because I think it's something that is a good, but it's really fragile. And it probably makes itself more fragile by claiming this, unapproachability and untouchability as something to discuss. And claiming to not have any presuppositions and to be sort of a perfectly closed sort of circle.
And maybe I wonder if that's the basis of some of the what we might call illiberalism, or the sort of wholesale rejection of the liberal tradition, is precisely that liberalism is so much in the air we breathe that it doesn't get an articulation and it doesn't get a defense, and there isn't a sort of inquiry, a sort of civic inquiry into what this foundational set of claims is and how it could be justified and where its liabilities are. The questioner is also, saying that there would have to be some kind of philosophical or religious grounding for any good policy. And it does seem that liberalism, as a purportedly neutral, sort of invisible framework, can't provide that, and at most would facilitate some kind of majoritarian tendency, or whatever the governmental structures allow. There'd be some kind of rough consensus or majority view on what philosophical or religious position ought to be put forward. It does seem to me that human beings are religious by nature, and that part of the problem with the secular order is that even the irreligious end up becoming religious practitioners, and so they bring all the zeal of religion to domains in which religious aspirations can't be satisfied. And that seems to me part of the predicament of a secular society is everyone's trying to do religious work, and some of them are doing it in venues where they're not going to get what they seek. And indeed, there could be over time an impoverishment of aims if that religious impulse isn't properly recognized and somehow directed in ways that are likely to be both wholesome and successful.
That brings us back to the sort of earlier question, where we have a funny position where people who are overtly religious want to, quote unquote, take the Benedict option. I thought, form these little communities and sort of just take themselves out of the stream of American life. Whereas people who, which I suppose everybody else, has these inchoate or unfulfilled religious longings that are not incorporated into any, overtly religious structure, and they are more more plugged in and more engaged than ever before. But
Yeah.
they might, the Benedict option might have something to say to them as well.
Uh-huh.
But if what you're saying is true, if these longings are being tried, if the fulfillment of these longings is being sought in venues that don't really admit of permanent solutions,
Mm-hmm.
and that require lots of compromise,
Mm-hmm.
and don't look too good,
Mm-hmm.
and look too incremental when they come out of the other side of the machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we have basically run to the end of our time. Unless there's some other questions here that you all see that we haven't, in a certain sense, touched on already.
Let's see. Yeah.
Maybe we could actually have one last question, and this might be a good one and a kind of general one. What
Mm-hmm.
kind of good can, in fact, be held in common?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a good
Right.
question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we were expressing some confusion about whether a Lockean good can truly be held in common. Is it enough to have the preservation of property as a shared aim? So I think I would start by saying it sounds like we have our doubts about whether that qualifies as a shared good that's sustainable. Question remains: what would be a proper good?
Yeah, I mean, I might be a little less down on Locke than Mr. McDonald, but I understand a lot of the reasons why he is so down on him.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'll just say something like this. It seems to me that the things that are shared kind of come in at the bottom and come in at the top in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
That is, there's a sort of low but solid thing that I think is shareable, which is, I don't know what we want to call that, like rule of law and a sort of basic modicum of security and
Mm-hmm.
a preservation of the realm you were sort of calling the commons, like air, water,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
clean soil and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those things are shareable in the sense that there's such a clear overlapping of interest. And then the problems start to come when people are feel excluded from those, or are they're distributed unequally, or someone's hoarding more than their share or something like that. But those are claims that are sort of asking for, they admit the premises of what's going on, and they're just asking for a better distribution of something that within a sort of existing system. And then I think, okay, those things can sort of be shared, but then you start getting to things that can't really be shared, all kinds of zero-sum things like greater forms of material success, recognition and fame, and certain relationships. I mean, how much strife in the world is there because of love and things like that, where there's something that is very difficult to share in some ways. And then I think, though, the shareable comes in again at this elevated level of philosophy, where this pursuit of truth is something that is no less present in each of the participants, and there's a common stock that can't really be exhausted there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean that's one of the things I like about the Republic, where you have all of the political problems about sharing come in, and they have these really unworkable solutions involving communal possession and property and all these things. But the group of people having the conversation and what you might call the dialogic city or something, they're without even realizing it in a way are sharing in a kind of unproblematic way. Of course, there is a problem because their philosophic sharing depends on the messy world of politics and economic inequality continuing in a certain way. But I don't, and I think there's some recognition of that in the dialogue, frankly. But I don't think that really detracts from the fact that a good that can be shared has been discovered by Socrates and his friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the good of philosophic discourse. I take it. But even that, doesn't that have to be undergirded by something that's more like a religious principle?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, when you say something like the unexamined life is not worth living, mm-hmm. I mean, I think Socrates said something like, if I said that, none of you would believe me. And if I said, well, the God has commanded me, I have to,
right.
harass all of you all day, that'll make you angry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's some problem where the undergirding of that way of life is hard to share. Mm-hmm. And it is in and of itself questionable, mm-hmm. whether the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, mm-hmm. the problem of reason and revelation kind of begins to rear its head there.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, with that, why don't we end this conversation? I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank David McDonald and Seth Appelbaum for leading us in this conversation. I do want to put in a plug again for tomorrow evening's lecture, Teaching Poetry, Revelation, Mathematics, and Respect for Truth by Ted Hadzi-Antish. Again, that's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, and we will be having more talks next week. And with that, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate you being here.